loons. It has nothing to do with vision underwater, as far as we can tell, which is everybody's favorite story, but probably not true. Yeah.
Great. So it looks like we've hit 7 p.m. So I'd like to launch into just a brief background on LPC and on these talks before we get to Mark's presentation. There are still a lot of people posting questions in the YouTube chat. So I just want to let you all know that we will have a Q&A session at the end of Mark's talk. And so I'll be monitoring the questions, and some other LPC staff will be monitoring as well. And we'll make sure that all your questions get answered. But yeah, so thank you all for tuning in to our Thursday night nature talks. My name's Caroline Hughes, and I am a biologist at the Loon Preservation Committee. Before we get to the talk, I just want to talk a little bit about LPC and about the purpose of these talks. So LPC is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1975 in response to a declining loon population in New Hampshire. And sort of the principle behind LPC's founding was that if human actions had led to the declines that were being observed, and it was very likely that they had, then human actions could also reverse those trends. And so since then, we've been working to preserve and protect loons and their habitat in New Hampshire. And we take a four-pronged approach with that. So we do monitoring, which is just counting loons, counting how many chicks that they hatch each year and how many survive to the end of the season. We do management. So, extra strategies that we use to help loons succeed. So things like floating rafts, floating signs to alert boaters to the presence of loon nests or chicks and try to help people know how much space they should be giving loons. We also do a lot of outreach to dam operators to help control water levels during the nesting season. We do loon rescues, and we do a lot of other stuff as well, and that falls under that management umbrella. We do a lot of research on the problems that loons are facing and ways that we can help them face those problems. And we do education. And so that's where this Nature Talks series comes in. These talks are part of our work to educate the public about loons specifically, but also about the natural world as a whole and other species that loons share their ecosystem with. And so we'll be hosting these talks every Thursday night from now through August 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right on this channel. So hopefully you guys will be able to tune into some future talks as well. Okay, so now we can get to our speaker, Dr. Mark Pokras. So Mark is a veterinarian, and he's also an emeritus professor at the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine at Tufts University. And he's someone who has been involved with loons for a very long time. He regularly consults with LPC on things like loon necropsies and loon rescues, and he's working with many other organizations that are working on behalf of loons in all of North America, really. So with that, I'll let you take it away, Mark, and thank you so much for being here. We're very excited to learn about loons from you.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. I'm really pleased to be here tonight. I hope everybody can hear all right, and if you can't, certainly let me know. I'm going to take control of the screen share at this point and then turn on the PowerPoint. Let's see. There we go. Is everybody seeing that now as full screen? Carolyn, are we all set?
Yes, you are all set.
Great. Okay. Well, what I'm going to talk about tonight is actually a project I've been involved with for several years with a historian. Her name's down at the bottom, Teresa Barbo Mitchell. And one of the things we got involved with, we've been working, as Caroline said, with loons for quite a while. I mean, this is my 4th or 5th year working with LPC on loons. And we all love loons for a wide variety of different things. And I'm sure many of you have on your bookshelves, as I have on mine, tons of books about loons. And they're wonderful coffee table books and lots of pretty pictures like the one here of the loon in flight. But we realized in working with LPC and other groups that one of the exciting things about all of this is not just the loons themselves, but it's the marvelous people who have contributed to the successes of loon conservation over the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And what Teresa and I are working on is we're actually working on a book on the history of loon conservation. And that's really what tonight's talk is all about, It's partially about loons and the biology of loons, but a lot of this is about people, like the people at LPC, Harry and Tiffany and John and Caroline and Linda and Lynn and everybody else there, who have worked so hard on this, but many other groups as well. So I want to go through this. I want to tell you about what I've gotten excited with and some of the people I've gotten to know. And you'll notice on that first slide, I've put my email. And because this book is still in the works, if any of you have thoughts about things that I say that are wrong, or things that you think should be included, or people that I should talk to, or something like that, please feel free to email me. There's always room for improvement. And I will look forward to hearing from some of you. All right, so let's get going. So I'm not going to expand on the biology of loons. I think probably everybody here knows what a loon is. They're aquatic. Piscivorous means, of course, they eat mostly fish, as the loon in here. They're cool from a biology point of view in that they're both freshwater and marine seasonally, and they're very long-lived. Like bald eagles, like people, like elephants, they have a long lifespan and a very low reproductive rate, which has a lot of conservation implications. What we've got here, this is an old map, and the green is where in our hemisphere loons breed. And you can see it's from Iceland across the northern part of the continent. And the blue is more or less where they winter. If you're going to update this map, we would probably have some loons wintering down here along Baja California, the Gulf of Mexico, a little further south, because some of those western loons do winter down there. So in terms of loon history, we have to go way back before Europeans came over here. Clearly, the loons were here before the people were here. I mean, if you think about the first ancestors of Native Americans and indigenous people coming across, either across the Bering Straits or by sea, I mean, there's a lot of theories about that. They probably came over between 15 and 25,000 years ago. But loons were here before that and breeding on northern lakes. And so when people got here, they started interacting with loons in many different ways. And one of those, of course, is utilization in terms of eating loons, in terms of using parts of loons' bodies for decoration, for warmth. And so these are some Yupik clothing that are in a museum, just to show you some of the things that we may not think about using loons for today, but had very practical considerations for people historically in this part of the world. And I don't think I even need to talk about this, but in addition to being just something to utilize, loons appear in many native people's legends for a whole variety of different things, for their vision, for their speed, for their connection to the gods, and there are books written about loon legends. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go into that tonight. That would probably be a whole nother 2-hour lecture, but there's some really cool stuff out there. And of course, any of you who are interested in art are probably familiar with much of the modern art being produced by First Nations and indigenous peoples having to do with loons, particularly in Canada and the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. In terms of the Western world, if you think about loons, the whole genus of loons, Gabia, the whole order Gabiiformes, there's only 5 species of loons in the world. But the common loon, the one that breeds in New Hampshire, is pretty much a bird of the Western Hemisphere. They don't breed in any numbers in Northern Europe or Northern Asia, but they do winter over there. And so British ornithologists, Scandinavian ornithologists, even back in the 14, 15, 1600s, knew what common loons were. They just didn't have them as a breeding species. As far as I can tell, this is the first illustration of a common loon from the New World. John White was sent over by Sir Walter Raleigh to start a colony in Virginia in 1585, and he was an artist as well, and did a report on the Newfoundland. And here's a common loon, the first illustration that we can find of this bird in the New World. And of course, you know how loons have been represented in art over the years. The great American ornithologist, the father of American ornithology, Alexander Wilson, featured them in his book. Audubon, of course, who sort of succeeded Wilson, had wonderful loon drawings in there. Now, they were discovering things at that point. You know, Audubon made some mistakes in his description of loons. One of the things he says in the book is loon nests always have 3 eggs. And as LPC people could tell you, and I'm sure it's on the website, loons pretty much always have 2 eggs, occasionally 1 and rarely 3. So, you know, this is what science does. Science discovers things and describes things, but it's self-correcting over time. At least it's supposed to be. Back in the early days, if you think about colonial days and so forth, not everybody liked loons. Of course, they were being shot to eat as food on the frontiers and things of that nature. But there was also a predator prejudice. This was true of birds of prey, hawks and owls. It was true of wolves and mountain lions and grizzly bears and many other species. Is they were evil, they were bad. They were competing with people for food and for space, and they were dangerous. And so if you read Walden by Thoreau, he talks about people going to Walden Pond. First thing in the spring when the ice was out and the loons hit the lake, the next day, people were there with rifles trying to shoot the loons. It was considered not just good sport, it was considered to be good citizenship and sportsmanship. And there's many descriptions in the literature of the 1800s of shooting loons for a whole variety of different purposes. The state of New York even put them in a report called Winged Enemies of Fish. And there was a bounty in many states, including New Hampshire, on loons for quite a while. When you read some of the old explorers' descriptions, this is Nansen trying to discover the North Pole with Lieutenant Johansen, and the title of this picture is Dr. Nansen and Mr. Jackson shooting loons on Cape Flora. And they were shooting them for food. When I look at the picture, I think those look a lot more like mergansers than loons, but that's what he said in the expedition. And so because they were shot for food, there are recipes. This is an old one from Nova Scotia, and I'll let you read it, but clearly loons were nobody's favorite food. They're not said to taste good, and it probably has to do with what they eat. And even when you look at First Nations cookbooks, this is an Eskimo cookbook put out in 1952. And I've got a copy of this, you know, it says in there, you know, don't make loon soup. It's supposed to be terrible. So. On the other hand, on the ocean, it was traditional along the East Coast for loons to be shot in fairly large numbers on migration, particularly in fall migration. And if you look at Forbish's book, Birds of New England, he talks about loons being shot in huge numbers off Cape Cod in migration. And this persisted up until probably the 1970s, even when it had long been illegal on a small coastal island off Nova Scotia called Harker's Island. This is one of the last loon shooters down on Harker's Island. And a friend of ours, Paul Spitzer, who's a loon biologist, went down there and interviewed the Harker's Island people about this, and you know, because loons are said to taste pretty bad. And what the Harker's Island folks said is that they purify themselves in migration. You know, they're eating something different on the ocean, and they actually taste better. So it's no longer done, at least not legally. And even, you know, we think about loon clothing back in the era of Native American civilizations when they were the dominant civilization on the continent. But even in the late 1800s, a lot of wildlife was killed for fashion, for clothing. And usually when we read about the history of the National Audubon Society and the killing of gulls and terns and hummingbirds for clothing, which is why hunting laws were put into effect and why the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was passed and to protect these species from being decimated. We don't think about loons, but loons were part of the fashion trade in the gay 90s. But things changed between about the 1880s and the early 1900s. People's attitudes changed dramatically. They saw that the frontier wasn't endless. You know, and back in Audubon's days, in Jefferson's days, the country seemed endless. The resources seemed boundless. You could go out and shoot as many passenger pigeons as you want. You could shoot as many buffalo as you want. It was an infinite resource out there. By the 1890s, it was clear that this wasn't the case. Things were disappearing. There's some wonderful, awful writing about Squam Lake in the 1890s, where it was so badly polluted by farm waste and sawdust from wood production, and the water clarity was terrible, and there were algal blooms, and the fish were dying. And we don't think about that with Squam Lake today. But people's attitudes changed. And of course, there were people like Gifford Pinchot and John Muir, and of course, one of the most famous ones, Teddy Roosevelt, who, when he was governor of New York, was instrumental in creating the Adirondacks Park in New York. And then later on, creating some of the great national parks in the western part of the country. And as you see, here's a quote from a 1901 Field and Stream about how you just weren't hearing loons in the Adirondacks anymore. People were sad because things were changing so dramatically. And this is 120, 130 years ago. New Hampshire turned out to be ahead of the game. In the 1880s, the first act was introduced into the New Hampshire state legislature to protect loons because they were being shot so extensively and because they were disappearing from lakes. It didn't pass. In fact, it never passed. It was introduced every year from 1881 until the early 1900s. And you can see the wording down at the bottom. But people were trying. People were understanding that the world just wasn't what they remembered. It wasn't what it was like when they were kids. And how many of us feel that way today? You know, you go places that you used to love and it's been paved, it's been bulldozed. You know, it's like Joni Mitchell's song, They Paved Paradise. And we in ecology, we call this issue that of shifting baselines. You know, nothing's like what we remember it. And even John James Audubon wrote about this. If you read biographies of John James Audubon, when he was an old man, he looked back at what had changed and he so regretted how the world had changed, and he regretted how many birds he had shot to paint the paintings in his marvelous volumes. Other stories about loons abound. William Brewster was a New England birder ornithologist who, from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, spent a lot of time on Lake Umbagog, which is now a national wildlife refuge that has abundant loon populations. But he wrote about people shooting out the loons on Lake Umbagog. And in 1924, one of the things he was most concerned about was the invasion of motorboats to Lake Umbagog. He said, you know, the motorboats are scaring the loons away. And this was 1924. So none of these are new problems and we haven't solved them yet. But science gets better and new technology keeps getting invented. And one of the things that happened in about the time that Brewster was up on Umbagog, a young ornithologist, Arthur Allen, was starting to record bird songs using relatively new technology. And he had an inventor working with him, one of his graduate students, Peter Paul Kellogg. And they started to record bird songs. And this is a picture of them in the 1940s in the Adirondacks with some of their apparatus. You had to have a truck to carry the things that would allow you to record birdsong. On the lower left is a woman named Linda Macaulay, And many of you will know the Macaulay Laboratory of Natural Sounds at Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. She's carrying in her hand all you need to record bird songs these days. The technology has changed dramatically. But Arthur A. Allen founded the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, and Peter Paul Kellogg was the first director of the Library of Natural Sounds. And this actually factors into loon conservation, because one of the things that Arthur Allen did was go to the Adirondacks in the 1940s to make some of the first recordings of common loons. I'm going to switch now from New England to the Midwest for a minute, because although many good things happened in New England, things were starting to happen at the same time. In the Midwest, in Minnesota and Wisconsin, Sigurd Olson and Sigurd Olson's son, also Sigurd Olson, one was Sigurd F, the other was Sigurd T, were doing incredible conservation work. And the son, Sigurd T, did his PhD thesis on loons in the Midwest, and it was in 1952, and it was a seminal publication on loon biology. It was the best thing ever published for many years on the biology of common loons. And we're digitizing that and putting it online. But this led to the foundation of the Sigurd Olson Environmental Institute in Wisconsin at Northland College, where some of the Midwest loon research and citizen science takes place. It's sort of like LPC West. And Erica Lemoyne directs the program out there, and they do wonderful work. So we had the 50s, the 40s when loons were being recorded, the 50s when Sigurd Olson was doing some of his graduate work. And then what happened in the 60s? For those of us who are of a certain age, we remember this because we were there. The world seemed to be falling apart. We were worried about nuclear war. We were worried about endangered species. Populations of species like bald eagles and peregrine falcons and whooping cranes and puffins and loons were dropping through the floor. They seem to be disappearing every place. And then Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, 1962. And that led to an incredible rise in consciousness on people's part, an incredible concern about the future of the earth and our health and the health of species around us. In 1970, we held the first Earth Day. I was there for it. And young people from all over the world got together to try and do something. And all of these threads, people working in the Midwest, people working in the Adirondacks, people working in the Northeast, were starting to come together. Instead of just these individual researchers like Sigurd Olson going out and doing a graduate thesis on this, people were starting to talk. Communication was changing, even though we didn't have the internet yet. One of these people was Jack Barr, a younger man at that point, but Jack Barr was a Canadian biologist. He grew up in Algonquin National Park, north of Toronto and Montreal. They're a wonderful place. I know Harry loves to go there for vacation. And Jack did his PhD thesis there, and he did it on effectively why loons were disappearing, and it had to do with acid rain. The picture you see in the middle there, other than Jack doing the dissection, is the metal mines in Sudbury, Ontario, where the smoke from the metal mines and the smelters was so bad and created such acidity that everything died. All the vegetation died, the fish in the lakes died, the loons stopped breeding, and Jack went up to do his PhD work on this, on acid rain. And Jack's work is actually some of the first work that found an association between elevated environmental mercury levels and acidification of lake waters. That picture of Jack is from later on when, in 1989, when the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened. Jack was one of the lead biologists to investigate loons from the Exxon Valdez oil spill and the effect on loons. And this is Jack doing a postmortem examination of a loon up in Alaska. And Jack still lives just outside of Toronto. He's quite a character. Another very influential person on that at that point is a guy named Joe Karakis. Joe's a Hungarian limnologist who immigrated to Canada many years ago, worked for Canadian Wildlife Service. And he's not a loon guy. He's a limnologist. He studies water quality. He studies water chemistry and things like that. He's happiest in the chem lab. And he spent many years in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, Quebec, studying acid rain. And you can see from my chart there that how acid the rain was. You know, normal rain is going to have a pH up between 5 and 6, just below neutral. And in many areas, we found that the pH of the rain was the pH of tomato juice, or in some cases, the pH of vinegar. And once you get down to pHs of 4.5 and below, where things are more acid, you don't have any fish living in that water. And that has amazing effects on things like loons. And when I talked to Joe about this, and I said, Joe, how did you ever become a loon biologist? He said, I didn't know anything about loons. He said, I didn't really care anything about loons. He said, I was studying acid rain and I was studying fish, and I needed something to help indicate what was going on with the fish. And that's how I got into loons. At the time Joe was doing that, Jack was doing that, Sigurd Olsen was doing it in the Midwest. Two things were happening. One is Judy McIntyre. And if you look at the upper picture, there are three very important people in loon conservation history. Judy McIntyre, Rawson Wood in the middle, and Scott Sutcliffe on the right. Here in New Hampshire, as a matter of fact, and this was 1979. Judy McIntyre was a mom, a housewife, an interior decorator. Her major in college had been French, but she became a backyard bird watcher. And one day saw a bird that she didn't know, and she called up the local college, and they couldn't help her identify it. And she said, can I take an ornithology course? But she hadn't had any science courses as an undergraduate, and they said, you don't have the prereqs, you can't take the course. Judy's a little stubborn. And so she called the instructor up and she talked her way into the course and ended up staying and getting a master's in ornithology and then getting a PhD in ornithology, specializing in loons, never having had an undergraduate science course. And when I talk about Judy, I call her the Jane Goodall of loons. This is the woman that did it all. This is the woman that really changed the course of loon conservation in North America, and to whom much is owed. She started, when she was still working on her PhD thesis, a citizen science program on loons in Minnesota. She started a children's educational program on loon conservation in Minnesota. She published her book, Spirit of Northern Lakes, from her PhD thesis. She had a cover article on her work in National Geographic. And she finished her PhD in 1973, had trouble getting hired as a woman in higher education back in the day. But something magic happened. Judy met Jack, and Judy and Jack met Rawson Wood. Now, Rawson Wood was a retiree. He was a retired businessman with a summer place on Squam Lake. And he was very concerned that loons were disappearing from Squam Lake. And he'd sort of heard that there was this weird woman in the Midwest who was working on loons. And they got in touch and they got together, and sparks started to fly with Jack and Judy and Rawson. The lower picture is me with Judy a couple of years ago. So she's still around. She's 89 this year. Here's Rawson. So Rawson is a retired businessman. The picture in the canoe was him in the Adirondacks in 1954, before he bought his New Hampshire place and moved his family up here for summers. And the picture on the right is Rawson's 100th birthday party at LPC, which many of us were at, and it was a wonderful party. But Rawson got very concerned, and he was basically a citizen scientist. He had no science training. He wanted to be a lawyer, but that didn't work out. And he got involved with Squam Lake Association back in the late 60s, and trying to do something to help loons in Squam Lake. Well, at the same time, there was a wonderful birder, ornithologist, conservationist named Tudor Richards, who was the director of Audubon Society of New Hampshire at the same time. And they got to be friends and concerned about this loon stuff. And Tudor decided to start a committee in the Audubon Society of New Hampshire. They were going to call the Loon Preservation Committee. And he talked Rawson into chairing the committee. He was probably sorry later on that he had, because Rawson took that committee and ran with it. And it got bigger, and it moved away from New Hampshire Audubon Society and finally became the LPC that we know today as a separate conservation organization. But a spin-off of that, and this had to do with Rawson and Jack and Judy working together, was they said, you know, we've got this good stuff going on with loons in New Hampshire. We've got this good stuff going on with loons in the Midwest. But there's a lot of places where there are loons where people aren't doing anything. And Rawson was sort of evangelical, and I guess Judy was too. And so they took the show on the road. They started going around to different states where loons nested and Canadian provinces with slideshows and talks about loons. And they started loon preservation groups in Minnesota and Michigan and Montana and Wyoming and Idaho and Washington and several Canadian provinces. And the sum total of these, they incorporated as the North American Loon Fund. And that fund ran for a number of years and got a lot of people into research. It funded some of my first work. It funded some of Dave Evers' first work, Walter Piper's first work. So it brought a lot of young, enthusiastic people into the loon world, and started all these groups across the country. It put out wonderful educational materials. Bill Barklow, who got his PhD doing loon voice recording, put out the Voices of the Loon record. We had the movie On Golden Pond that took place in New Hampshire. And many of you will probably remember that movie. You've probably seen it. You remember the dead loon floating in there and Katharine Hepburn getting all excited about it. And you should know that that dead loon came from an LPC freezer for the movie. So all this sort of fits together. In Canada, Rob Alvo, who's still working on this issue, sort of took up Jack's work and is working on acid rain and problems with acid rain and loon in Canada. And he's got a postdoc graduate student, Kristen, working with him now. Doug Tozier and Kathy Jones run the National Loon Survey Program for Canada in Bird Studies Canada in Port Rowan, Ontario. Canada's different in that we see loons differently in New Hampshire than the Canadians do. In New Hampshire, they're a fairly rare bird. They're cherished. Every one is protected. But most of the common loons in the world are in Canada. There are roughly, and I'm going to sort of ballpark some numbers here, a little under 1 million, probably 800,000 or 900,000 common loons in the world. And of those, 3/4 of them are in Ontario and Quebec. We're at the very southern end of the range, if you remember that breeding map. So in Canada, where loons are, Canada has 3 million lakes, and loons are on a lot of them. And so because they're so common, they're not quite so concerned about them, and they don't put so much research and resource into studying them and protecting them. But Doug and Kathy have a network of volunteers around the country who monitor loons and report. Of course, you know how charismatic loons are if you've been to the LPC gift shop. But they appear on everything. And one of the things that happened with North American Loon Fund and Loon Preservation Society and all these state organizations, and I haven't maybe said this clearly enough, is we changed people's attitudes about loons. Think back to Thoreau's day. Loons were bad. Loons were shot. Loons were evil because they were eating our fish. And think about loons today. They're wonderful. They're charismatic. They appear on t-shirts like this one I got from the Michigan Loon Group. Um, you know, earrings, jewelry, mugs, everything you can possibly imagine. And although it's taken decades, the ethos of how we interact with this species across North America has changed dramatically. And so now we've got volunteers who work with different groups across the country. We have loon festivals. We have people going out and doing nest platforms and posting and doing loon cruises. We have other groups across the country like BRI that focus on loon research and particular environmental problems. BRI does a lot of work on environmental mercury with loons. Even though North American Loon Fund doesn't exist anymore, they disbanded in the early 2000s. Here in the Northeast, we've sort of regrouped all of the groups and agencies that work on loons, and we meet once a year to coordinate everybody's loon research and educational programs. And this is just a brief survey. And most years we meet at LPC. There are, what, Caroline, 40, 50, 60 biologists who spend 2 days at LPC coordinating all their efforts for the year. And it's a wonderful get together. And here's one from a couple of years ago. Our two token Canadians are on the end, Harry Vogel on the left and Rob Alvo on the right. And a lot of people from a lot of different states. And let's see, I see one from Wyoming and yeah, a few different places. So good group and sort of the core of loon biology and conservation here in the Northeast. We have two different studies that this combined group does. We've got the live loon studies that, you know, LPC and BRI and many of the other groups do, where they band the birds and take samples. And then we've got mortality studies where we try and figure out why loons die. And I could bore you to tears with that, but we'll run through a little bit of this. How are we doing on time, by the way? I should. Okay.
You're doing great.
All right.
Yeah, we're about 40 minutes in.
Okay. So just to review some of the, you know, I said we're going to talk about the people, and we've talked about a lot of the past people, but let's introduce a few of the present people. We've got wonderful people like Eric Hansen in Vermont, who runs the Loon program there. We've got the LPC people who run the fabulous program that we're participating in tonight. We've got the group in Maine that historically started with Ruth Surgison back in the early 80s and then was taken over by Sally Stockwell and Susan Gallo, and now Tracy Hart has just taken that over. And our loon count here in Maine is next Saturday for anybody who's interested. In Washington State, Dan and Ginger Polshuk basically are the Washington State Loon program. There are only, I think, 17 lakes in Washington on which loons currently breed. And Dan and Ginger monitor all of them. They're mostly in the eastern part of the state, sort of north of Spokane. But there's some new work being done out there, working closely with the state Fisheries and Wildlife Agency that I think is going to be very exciting in the future. They're going to get some good state involvement. Montana has a big loon group headquartered sort of in and around Glacier National Park, and it involves a bunch of state agencies. It was started as a citizen science group like LPC by Donna Love and Lynn Kelly back in the early 1980s. And as Lynn has said to me, well, you know, this strange guy from the East, Rawson Wood, came out here to do a talk, and he got us all excited about loons and convinced us we could do something about loons. And I hear that over and over again when I talk to people around the country, is it was Rawson Wood, you know, and that's true in Washington State too. Rawson started the Washington group. And so Montana has a license plate and a big group of agencies and people who work on monitoring loons out there. And in Montana, a lot of the loon breeding lakes are on Native American reservations. And so the Blackfoot Nation, the Flatheads, the Salish Kootenai are all involved in loon conservation on their tribal lands. In New York, Nina Schock started and runs the Adirondack Center for Loon Conservation. That is a red throat in her hands from an ice rescue. That's not a common loon. In Wisconsin, we talked before about the Sigurd Olson Center, but there are also some researchers out in Wisconsin like Mike Meyer and Kevin Keno. And this is actually a loon robot that Kevin brought to swim out in the field and attract the attention of loons that he was studying. We've got Jay Mager in Ohio, Paul Spitzer, who looks at wintering loons off the east coast of the United States from the mid-Atlantic states to Florida, Danielle D'Oria, who runs the state monitoring program in Maine for the Inland Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. We've got graduate students, people like Carrie Osborne, who have worked on both common and red-throated loons. We've got grand old men like Charlie Walcott, the former director of the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, and Walter Piper, who does a lot of his work in Wisconsin on loon social behavior and communication, and is a fabulous mentor to a lot of students. We've got veterinarians involved. Inga Seidor at University of New Hampshire, Michelle Nealand, who has worked at LPC, has worked at BRI, is now working with the Ricketts Conservation Foundation across the country, working on all different aspects of trying to help loons when they get in trouble, including trying to get lead fishing gear out of them. This is Maureen Murray doing an endoscopy on a loon. We've got people like Dr. Erica Miller working on loons that get hurt in oil spills. We've got people who do rescues of loons. This is Ginger Polshuk from Washington on the West Coast. And that's Nina Schock and an unidentified person in the yellow suit out on the ice in the Adirondacks trying to rescue a loon. And in Wisconsin, Kevin and Linda Grenzer do a lot of winter rescues. So there's a whole set of expertise on that. There are people who do wildlife rehabilitation for loons and, birds that have been hit by boats or swallow fishing gear, or in fact get injured by bald eagles or other loons. Loons are not always nice to one another if they get into territorial fights. We've had students, undergraduates, graduate students, veterinary students help either with the postmortem studies like the top picture or with LPC field studies. This is actually a graduate student from Colombia in Latino America, Estefania, who was at LPC a couple of summers ago, who's now back in Colombia. No loons in Colombia, she's studying other birds. We work with people at lots of different institutions. As Caroline said earlier, not just looking at loons, looking at aquatic systems, looking at plankton, looking at how different contaminants cycle through aquatic systems. And a newcomer to the program is Joe Ricketts and his Conservation Foundation. He's headquartered in Wyoming. He's particularly interested in Western loons, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho sort of area, and has started a foundation to do loon research out there. And it's his funding that is responsible for the development of this new technique of translocating loon chicks to new areas to try and establish new breeding opportunities. Vin Spaniolo works with Joe Ricketts at this point. Vin was an LPC guy for a while and then worked with BRI and sort of got some more field experience. And now he's headquartered in Wyoming and is in charge of the Ricketts Loon projects. And we got to think about what's the future. We have all of the old issues that loons have. We still have motorboat problems. We still have lead problems. We still have entanglement problems. We have new problems like a lot more bald eagles than there used to be. We have development problems on lakes. We have new pollution problems. And the big one that we're staring at for the future, and we just don't know, is the question of climate change and what climate change may do to loons. Because remember, we're at the southern end of their range, and what's going to happen when things get warmer. If we look at a map, and this is a BRI map, what I'd like you to focus on here, if you look at the key on the lower right, you'll see this sort of this light green where it says breeding range expanding for loons. And you'll see that part of that, I should use the arrow on the power. Part of that is sort of here in New England, Southern Ontario. Um, Part of that is here in Wisconsin and a smidge of Minnesota, and part of it is sort of Washington, Idaho, northern Montana. And you have to ask yourself, why? What's going on if we have places where the loons are actually doing better than they used to? And one of the key places for that is Vermont, Eric Hansen's stomping grounds. I mean, 25 years ago, and I won't get the numbers right, but there were probably under 20 nests of loons in Vermont, mostly in the southern part of the state. Now, most of the lakes in Vermont are saturated with loons. The breeding population has increased dramatically, and we have to say, what's changed? And I think, I don't have infinite wisdom on this, but I think when I look at these areas, and I know people in all these areas who are doing the work, I think what's changed is people's attitudes towards loons. We're not persecuting them anymore. We're seeing them as something that's desirable. My lakefront camp will actually, the real estate will be worth more if there are loons on the lake than if there aren't loons on the lake. I love to hear the calls in the middle of the night. And as people are valuing loons more, groups like LPC or the Vermont Center for Eco Studies or the Sigurd Olson Center in Wisconsin, or Dan and Ginger's work in Washington State are putting more people and more resources into loon protection and public education. And I think we're seeing signs here that's paying off in those areas. I'm going to run through a few quick problems that may be associated with climate change. One of them is fungal respiratory disease. We won't take time to talk about this. Another one is the explosion in an infectious disease, avian malaria, which we saw for the first time in loons in New England about, I'd have to go back and look, 6-7 years ago, something like that, with the bird on Lake Umbagog, I think. And now it's becoming much more common and is in fact killing loons in New England. We're seeing the introduction of exotic species of plants invading lakes, exotic species of invertebrates from fishing bait, from the aquarium trade, the pet trade, things of that nature that are changing the ecology of lakes in ways that aren't good for loons. And some of those invasive species are bringing with them invasive parasites. This is one called a thorny-headed worm that killed this loon in its intestine. And we never used to see these on loons on lakes in New England, but we are seeing this sort of thing more and more. Botulism, not a problem yet on our lakes in New England, but it's become a huge problem on the Great Lakes because of introduced exotic species. And we don't have time to go through the whole food chain, but starting in the early 2000s, every fall, there are outbreaks of botulism on the Great Lakes, and you can see a few dead loons on the shores of Lake Erie there on the bottom. And some years they've had 6, 7, 8, 9,000 loons die during fall migration from botulism. And basically, this is a water quality issue due to introduced species, due to algal blooms and things of that nature. And so water quality is the key. If you've got clean water and healthy fish populations, the loons will do fine. There are other pollutants. This is some work that Jim Peruk did when he was at BRI, studying loons that wintered on the Gulf of Mexico and then migrated up north for the breeding season. And he looked at oil-related chemicals that these loons brought with them. So because loons are flying back and forth, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles during migration, they can pick up chemicals in one area, take them someplace else, and these chemicals can affect their lifespan, it can affect their breeding, it can affect their sensitivity to disease, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done on these environmental pollutants. We know about lead. We won't talk about lead fishing tackle. LPC has devoted a huge amount of energy and resources in recent years to turning this around and trying to convince anglers that you can catch fish with non-toxic gear. It's just some information here on some of the places we've been successful introducing legislation on this. The European Union, as we talk, has legislation pending that would get rid of all uses of lead for all hunting and fishing throughout European Union countries. So we'll see where that goes. Entanglement in fishing line happens all too often. And this is something where, again, as people on the water, as people who love the lakes, anything we can do to prevent this deadly material from being out there. I mean, if you're going to fish, you're going to have to use line, but there are biodegradable lines out there. And we can, you know, if you find line out either underwater or tangled in trees or something, collect it. We have to collect it, and we have to try and get rid of it, because this is what we want. We want healthy loon populations throughout their range, raising lots of cute little chicks. So what do we need as we go forward in the future? Basically, we need everybody to do everything. You know, I'm speaking here as a veterinarian, Caroline is a biologist, but we need everybody's skills to get involved in this. We need people to volunteer and do the field observations. We need people to help raise money, to buy land, to build platforms, to do scientific studies, to buy supplies, whatever it happens to be. We need attorneys to help draft improved regulations and legislation to protect water quality and protect some of these emblematic species. We need educators to put together good materials, to take them around to groups, whether it's first person face-to-face sorts of things, whether we've got our masks on or whether we're doing it virtually. Whatever skills you've got, they fit into this conservation mantra in a good way. Because what we really need to do is save the world. You know, it's a modest goal. You know, any of you who've read Richard Louve's book, it's a marvelous book, Last Child in the Woods, because we're not just saving it for the loons, we're saving it for future generations. These are my grandchildren, and they mean the world to me. And saving loons and saving the environment for them is one of the reasons that I do it. And of course, young people all over the world are getting involved in this. You don't have to be Greta. They're in the front row to make a difference. I think that getting young people involved and excited, whatever their age, you know, as they say, 6 to 60, 5 to 105, whatever the right numbers are, there's something to be done. And we need everybody's energy in this to really make a difference, because the next 5 or 10 or 25 years are critical in terms of climate change, in terms of saving some of these endangered species, in terms of water quality, and there's something for all of us to do. And the loons know it. You know, here's a federal biologist, you know, putting out a loon nesting platform, and you could see the loon. You know, he or she appreciates the effort. One thing you should all know about, this was supposed to have happened this last year. Every 5 or so years, we try and have a big national or international meeting on loon biology and get hundreds of scientists and citizens and birders and rehabilitators together to talk about conserving loons. The last one was in Wisconsin in 2014, and we were supposed to have one this past year in Portland, Maine, but somehow this pandemic got in the way. We are rescheduling this. It will be in Portland, Maine. The thought now is maybe early 2022, maybe like March, April of 2022. So if you look at the website down at the bottom, briloon.org/2020loons, information will be posted there as we develop this. The committee who's working on this will have their next virtual meeting probably late in August to talk about potential meeting dates, and we'll see what we know about vaccines at that point. And there we have it. Sort of the history of loons in a nutshell. I hope that wasn't too wordy for everybody, but I'd be happy to hang around and answer whatever questions people might have.
Thank you, Mark. That was excellent. I've been keeping an eye on the chat as we've gone through. And I think a lot of the questions that have been asked thus far, you actually answered throughout the course of your discussion. We had some questions about climate change, but we can open up the floor now for anyone that has questions that you've been sitting on and waiting till the end. Please do ask now. There are a couple questions that were asked at the beginning that have not been directly answered yet. So one was about the loons that you mentioned that spend the winter off the coast of Baja California.
Yes.
And the question was, where are those coming from? Where do they breed?
Okay. I could do this in a couple of different ways. Should I go back to the map in the PowerPoint, or should I just do it by words?
I think the visual would be nice if it's easy enough to pull it up.
We'll find out. Give me a second. And we will try and do this quickly here if I can. Let's see that's not what I want. Hold on. Are you seeing the PowerPoint at this point?
I'm not. I'm still seeing.
Okay, I got to get back on screen share. That's what the problem is. Hang on.
While you're pulling that up, I can answer a more technical question that was asked, which is this talk going to be available later on from someone that missed the beginning? And the answer of that is yes. We will have it posted to our YouTube channel either later on tonight or tomorrow. So you'll be able to go back and watch the whole thing.
Okay. So can you see the map now?
Yes.
Okay. So, and again, I could talk longer than you want me to, but look at the North American continent. And basically in your mind, whoa, let me go back. In your mind, divide the continent sort of into thirds, draw a line down here like this, and a line down here like this. So there's sort of a western third, an eastern third, and a middle third. And this is very ballpark. But basically, if you're a breeding loon in this area, you go to the closest ocean. So you're wintering off this area, wherever it's ice-free. So most of the loons that breed in New Hampshire and Maine are wintering probably from Nova Scotia down to maybe Cape May, New Jersey, maybe the Chesapeake. There's a few weird animals that go further south, but the mass of our birds go here. So they're not flying that far. In fact, if a loon takes off from New Hampshire, from Squam or Winnipesaukee, and gets up a couple of thousand feet, it can probably see the ocean. And it's, and so it's going, okay, that's where I'm going for the winter, right there. Lots of fish, no problem. Same thing's true in the West. If you're in Alaska, if you're in BC, Northwest Territories, you're going out here. It turns out an awful lot of loons, and this is red throats, Pacifics, yellow-bills, commons, winter between Vancouver Island and the mainland here, and up here where the Haida Nation is. And Jack Barr has done a lot of research on wintering loons up in this area. So there's a huge wintering loon population there. But again, some of these loons go further south. Loons from the middle third either are going to the Gulf or they're going down here. So Kevin Keno in Wisconsin has put instrumentation on a lot of birds, and almost all of his Wisconsin birds are somewhere between the Florida Panhandle and the border of Louisiana and Texas. They're all down in here. If you look at birds from some of the sort of Western Canadian provinces here, some of them go down here, some of them go to Baja, some of them go off the southern coast of California. One of the issues is in the desert states down here, Nevada and Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and so forth, there aren't a lot of places for loons to stop. There aren't a lot of lakes. And so they either have to make direct single flights of, maybe 12 or 1,800 miles, or they have to stop on one of the few lakes out there, Mono Lake, Walker Lake, Pyramid Lake. There's only a few. And again, it all goes back to Jack and Judy. Back in the 1970s, Jack and Judy went out and studied all these lakes. And then later on, Dave Evers went out and did some work out there too. One of the problems with those lakes is that their water levels are way down and their water quality has declined tremendously. And on Mono and Pyramid and Walker Lake, there are no longer fish. The lakes have gotten too salty for fish to live. mostly because of agricultural runoff. And so loons still stop there, but there's nothing much for them to eat. Whereas phalaropes and grebes and some other birds that can feed on invertebrates, like brine shrimp and so forth, do stay there in large numbers. The people who live out there are actually working on water quality. There's some federal legislation in the books to try and return water to the lakes to bring the level up and bring the salinity down and reintroduce fish, but we're not there yet. And so, yeah, you have to look at this on a continent-wide basis. It's amazing. You know, the loons are not paying any attention to the political boundaries.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
The next question is about telling male and female loons apart and whether that's able to be done in the field.
Yeah, I think if you ask 10 different loon biologists, you're going to get 11 different opinions. If you're standing on the shore with binoculars and you see a pair and there's a size difference, the larger one is almost always the male. I would underline almost. You know, when we look at loons that we've had in the lab, you know, ones that come in injured or dead that we're measuring, we have had some very big females and some very small males. And so, you know, it's sort of like our species. Most men are bigger than most women, but not entirely. And so I think that's typical with loons in the field. If you look at Walter Piper's publications and Kevin Keno's and Dave Evers, they will all say to you that males average 21% larger than females. Whether that's actually true across the range of loons, I don't know. Nobody's really crunched the numbers, but typically if there's a larger loon, it's the boy. I find, at least with New England loons, beak shape can be somewhat helpful. The males tend to have a beak that's a little deeper and not quite as long. The females tend to have a little bit longer and skinnier beak when you're looking at a pair. Dave Evers insists that the males hold the feathers on their foreheads in a different position than the females. And if you look at those forehead feathers, they're held up a little bit more in males. I can't say it's ever caught my eye, but Dave's done a lot more field work on loons than I have. So I think there are some subtleties to this, but I think you can't always be sure. I would suspect that a certain percentage of the loons that we banned as males or as females we're doing wrong. You know, if you see a bird lay an egg, it's a female. If you know that a bird has given the yodel call, I would say it's almost certainly a male, but I have this little niggling doubt in the back of my mind that maybe some aggressive females might yodel sometimes. I don't know that. I'm making an educated guess.
We have a question that's more New Hampshire specific. So the question is, aside from lead poisoning or motorboats, what is the biggest danger in New Hampshire for the loons? So maybe go back to the graph that you had, if you're able to.
Sure, let me see if I can find that quickly. Hang on. And you may know that, Caroline, off the top of your head better than I know.
Yeah, I guess the question would be whether it's in terms of mortality or everything together, you know, the loons we rescue. Because other than lead, I'd say fishing line entanglement is a big rescue thing. And we do have a couple loons that we collect every year that have died from fishing line entanglement because they just haven't been able to eat and we weren't able to rescue them. And then, you know, especially early on in the season, other loons and loon fights.
Yeah. If you look at this, I think you can probably see the bar graph now. Can everybody see that all right?
Yes.
You'll see that we've got several sources of trauma there. We've got trauma at 9%, non-specific trauma. We've got boat collision at 5%, which is trauma. And then we've got loon trauma down at 4%. That 9% trauma, that's trauma where we don't know what caused it. And Carolyn and I email a lot about that sort of thing. You know, LPC had a loon, a couple of weeks ago that came in with just a terribly nasty wing fracture that had to be put to death. It had to be euthanized because it wasn't fixable. And we don't know what caused that. We speculated on, could it have been caused by a fight with another loon? I think it's pretty unlikely, but I'm not sure. Could it have been caused by an interaction with a bald eagle? I don't think so, with that being the only wound. But again, I'm not sure. To me, if I was guessing, I would guess boat hit, but it's a guess. This is part of the whole forensic process, is trying to figure out what the best evidence is. And when we don't know, we just have to call it trauma.
So the last question that we have in the queue is, how much longer will there be loons in New Hampshire given climate change? And you sort of got to that question, and I think the answer is probably sort of, it depends on what we do. But did you have any further thoughts?
Not really. I mean, there are certainly, if you look at the National Audubon Society report, it's fairly pessimistic. I think there are a couple of different variables there. One variable is the human action variable. What do we do to protect loons in New Hampshire? Whether that's trying to reduce the increase in temperature, if we can reduce other sources of death, if we can reduce boat hits and lead poisoning and fishing line entanglement and all these other things, that will help keep the population stronger for longer, clearly. One of the things we don't know about loons is how resilient they're going to be in the face of climate change. As we said earlier, there are 5 species of loons. The other 4 don't breed anywhere near this far south. They breed in Alaska, they breed in northern Canada, they breed down to sort of central Canada, and they stop. They don't seem to be able to tolerate the elevated temperatures at all. Only the common loon breeds this far south, and that's been true throughout recorded history. I mean, if you go back to the earliest records from white people, at least, of loons breeding in the continental United States, there's one nest record from Western Pennsylvania in the late 1800s. There's one nest record from New Jersey. There's a couple from Rhode Island. There's a couple from Northern California, but before they destroyed the wetlands out there. But loons, I mean, since the glaciers retreated, have never bred much further south than this. And one of the things we don't know as biologists is what keeps the southern range the southern range. When I drive down to New Jersey or Delaware or Pennsylvania or West Virginia, and I look at a lake, I see wonderful lakes, and they're clear, and they've got nesting islands, and they've got the fish species in there like sunfish and yellow perch and crayfish that loons love to eat. Loons have never bred there as far as we know. Why not? And we don't know whether the adult loons themselves can't tolerate the elevated temperatures, or whether the eggs during incubation can't tolerate the elevated temperatures. These are things that hopefully we'll understand better in the coming years, but we just don't know at this point.
We got a question about the necropsies and who's doing them in New Hampshire and who's doing them, in the other parts of the US where we're collecting.
Oh my gosh, it's a moving target. In New Hampshire, and Carolyn can speak to it. Carolyn is one of the people who's doing some in New Hampshire. Currently in New Hampshire, some of them are being done by the pathologists at University of New Hampshire, Inga Seidor, David Needle, and Colleen Monahan. And some of them are being done on site at LPC, either by staff there, like John and Caroline, or by veterinary students who spend the summer there. We have one there, Emily, who's there this summer. I go over once in a while when we're not social distancing, and we'll do some. And I'm gonna put in an outright barefaced plug for LPC right at the moment. One of the things that's happening right now is LPC is raising funds for their new building, not their new building, to expand their existing building and improve their facilities. And one of the things that we're specifically designing is better laboratory facilities, so that we can improve diagnostic work on loons, so that we can improve necropsy facilities for loons, so that we can store better samples and do more research. So if any of you who are listening happen to win the lottery and want to know about a good cause, this is one of my favorites. And I often tell Harry, who's the LPC director, this is why I buy lottery tickets. You know, if I ever win, you know, LPC will benefit. But yeah, and so that's New Hampshire. It's different in each different state, and I don't think we have time. I can tell you who does them in every state because I literally email every week with everybody in every state about the loons. And so in New York, it's the State Fish and Wildlife Agency working with pathologists at Cornell. In Michigan, it's the State Fish and Wildlife Agency. In Washington State, it's in transition. It's going to be a pathologist at the veterinary school there in Pullman. And so it's different in different states. And this is, but one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to make sure that everybody who's doing this shares data. We have some websites set up where everybody's photographs and x-rays and data from all these necropsies across the country all go into a common data space so we can share it.
There's a question that's sort of calling back to the males versus females thing. Yes. and the potential for males to have a more squared off
yes.
Brow. So someone says, I once heard that the squared off head was a display of concern or fear. So is that the same brow shape that that Dave was referring to, or is that something different?
I believe it's the same brow shape that David is referring to. Yes.
Okay. So there's,
and I've seen both genders do something like that, but, and now I'm going to extrapolate. I don't actually know this, but I like to make stuff up, so take it for what it's worth. But when I think about what David has said and what people at LPC have taught me, and Walter Piper in Wisconsin in particular, who's written a lot about loon behavior, if you think about the different gender roles in loons, the male is the one who chooses the territory. And I think is the one who probably has the greater site attachment to that spot, and maybe the one who expresses that concern more easily. So you might see the male doing that sort of thing and being worried more than you might the female, who may, and again, I'm not in her head. I don't exactly know what's going on, but maybe she doesn't have quite that same site attachment that he does. We should ask Walter. He would have a good answer for that.
There's another question that's going back to this bar graph of loon mortality. And they're wondering if this sort of general pattern where lead fishing tackle is the highest, does that hold true for other states, or do these causes of mortality differ state to state?
They vary significantly from state to state. And some states have been more successful than New Hampshire has on the lead issue. When we started out looking at this, which is what, 30 years ago, most state graphs look like this. No other state was as high as New Hampshire up in the 40s. If you looked at Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, New York, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Washington, and Wyoming, the states that we had data for early on, they were all somewhere between 19 and 26% lead mortality. And with New Hampshire being the highest in the 40s. Washington State has effectively eliminated lead poisoning as a problem. They haven't had a lead poisoning case. Now, they don't have very many loons in Washington State, but their lead poisoning has effectively stopped, which is interesting. The Vermont lead poisoning cases have gone down way more than the New Hampshire ones have. Two adjacent states, and yet very different responses and I have to think that this is, it's not because New Hampshire is not trying harder. In fact, New Hampshire has a much more aggressive program than Eric does in Vermont. I think it's probably public response, and I think it may have to do with the kind of fishing that takes place in the different states. I think Vermont has a lot of smaller lakes and streams, and there's a lot more fly fishing where they don't tend to use lead, or they're using very small lead objects. New Hampshire, with its bigger lakes, may have more bass fishermen or something where they're using bigger objects. We actually could use a study on this. Maine has seen a slight decline in lead poisoning use. There's a graduate student, Brooke Hafford, who just did her master's degree on that. And Maine hasn't come down anywhere near as well as Vermont or Washington have, but certainly done a little bit better than New Hampshire. So it varies from state to state.
And now we have another question about lead poisoning, which is what are they ingesting and how are they getting the lead?
Just so happens I have some right here. Let me get a prop.
Sure.
I don't have all the props here I wish I had. Let's see. Oh, there's. Whoop. Okay. So there's the camera. All right. So basically, can everybody see that pretty well? I mean, it's focused. I don't know if I get out of the way, will the camera focus differently? So this is a small hook with a piece of lead that's cast on it. It's called a jig or a jig head. And that little round thing on there is lead. And this killed a loon that swallowed it. So that fraction of an ounce of lead is more than enough to kill an adult loon. And if you go out and buy fishing lures, here's a rubber minnow, and it's got a hook in it, and that hook has a little lead sort of soldered onto the shaft, and that again is more than enough to kill a loon or anything else that ate it. You know, just here's another jig head. This one I just bought to take pictures of, so it hasn't killed anything. But there's another jig head, and oftentimes they're made to look like animals. So there's many different kinds of sinkers and jigs and lures that contain lead as a weight to help cast the object, or to help sink it in the water column.
Great. Well, I think we have come to the end of our questions. So thank you so much for the presentation, Mark. I learned a lot. And from looking at the YouTube comments, it looks like a lot of people have learned a lot. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with all of us.
My pleasure.
And before I end this meeting, I just want to put in another plug for our future Thursday Night Nature Talks. At the beginning, I said 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Someone corrected me. It's actually Eastern Daylight Time that these will be held every Thursday from here through August 20th. So we'll have a variety of topics. We've got amphibians coming up. We've got the recovery of peregrine falcons in New Hampshire. We've got trends in various bird species. And then we're going to be ending with a loon presentation from Harry Vogel, the executive director of LPC, where he will be talking about the data that we've collected this year and sort of putting this year in the context of the long-term population trends. So I hope that people will be able to join us for those future talks. Thank you so much for watching this talk. And again, thanks so much to you, Mark.
My pleasure, and thanks to everybody who was able to tune in.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.